Welcome to Indie Film Forum. I'm your host, Kalpana Biswas. I'm delighted to introduce you today to actor, director, and educator Robert Adanto, who is a graduate of NYU and department head for film and TV production at the Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. His feature-length documentaries include The Rising Tide, which explores China's explosive rise through the eyes of the famous Chinese photographers and video artists, Pearls on the Ocean Floor, about Iranian female artists inside and outside the Islamic Republic, City of Memory, about artists grappling with catastrophic loss and memory in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and his latest, The F Word, about sexuality and the art of fourth-wave feminists. His films have enjoyed extensive screenings at film festivals and museums worldwide and have received several awards. I'm thrilled to have Robert Adanto joining us today via Skype from New York. Welcome, Robert. Welcome to Indie Film Forum, Robert. The first time I met you was in LA at the film festival, Women's Voices from the Muslim World. And what I find most interesting about your films is how they explore the reactions of artists to cataclysmic events, whether they are social, political, or natural, and how you interweave them together to make your films. What's your thought process?
I really think that a lot of the topics, they have to really intrigue me. Some of the topics I've done, I've had a strong understanding because I maybe taught about China or taught about the Middle East or taught about the Iranian Revolution. I've always been very interested in how artists, whether they be poets or visual artists, respond to that tremendous change, that kind of radical shift, whether it be something, as you said, in society or come about through political change, or as with City of Memory and a hurricane known as Katrina. And I tend to choose art that, after I've researched the topic before doing interviews, I feel that visually it'll reaffirm or support some of the things that these artists have said in prior interviews that were in print. I started that film in June of 2009, just 8 days after the botched election. That was the very, very beginnings of the Green Movement in Iran, and a lot of the artists, if they're in one of the diasporas, were trying to get in touch with their family. I guess that's part of the magic of that film, is that there was an urgency on their part to talk about these things and show a connection between historical events like the Iranian Revolution and the war, and now looking back fondly and trying to reconnect with that place they call home.
Once you lose something for life, and you know you can never get it back, it sort of stays inside you. And with me, it's my childhood and my past. I left Iran, and in some ways Iran changed. And what I do, I try to recreate that. I keep finding things from my past or other people's past, and by bringing them back to now, I recreate. And therefore I can visit my own childhood, or I can visit my own past. And I believe that in my own life, my own experience, you have to walk this life, you have to walk this way to find the key, to discover yourself. And for me, part of this journey is through my art. I constantly trying to get closer and closer to the real me, real inside me, by using my art, by creating my art. women in general in our society in Iran, and artists who reflect that society, who give very close snapshots of what that society looks like, do live a very dual life. There is the public arena where they have to behave a certain way, and there's the private arena where they pretty much have freedom of expression. That's behind closed doors, which is quite unfortunate. And of course, the other area, which you need to point out, since we're talking about art, is the canvas or the photographic paper. That is their freedom of expression. And they use that very much to express their thoughts about existential anguish, which plays a very, very important role. It's a very big theme.
Iranian women were very divided about the 1979 revolutions. There were a group of elite women who resisted it all the way, and in particular resisted the idea of women covering and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, there was a very large number of intellectual, educated, articulate women who were actually arguing that the West has offered us very little, except a culture of beauty myths, selfishness, women becoming even more of an object of gaze than they were before. And their argument was that if we return to the teachings of Islam, we find that women are respected, they're independent, and the whole idea of covering is actually about becoming a person, so that people are not always saying you're too tall, you're too short, your eyes are this way or that way, and you're not forever having surgery and plastic surgery to look better, but it's actually you're covered. So people can hear your voice and they can't comment on your body. And so there was a very feminist analysis of the objectification of women and the argument that Islam would actually offer a better alternative. And the two sides really could not see eye to eye until long after the revolution.
So after the Islamic Revolution, it was a little bit tricky going back and forth very easily. So there was good 12 years that I didn't go back. But when I did go back in the 90s, and then I went back pretty frequently up until 1996, I found it really very interesting, as difficult as it was, and as different as it was from what I had remembered during the Shah's time. It was, in my own primitive way, I can describe it as if it was like going to a communist country, in a sense that it felt, everything felt so controlled. If everything felt like, almost like the color was lifted out of the face of this country and everything was black and white.
My mother passed away. I wasn't there, and I went for her funeral. I came back to Paris feeling totally obsessed with this idea that I have to tell my mother that I'm not forgetting her, So I started doing this project with this family, with these old pictures that were more colorful and all that. And I had a great time because I would look at these old pictures. I never met my grandfather. But I did what I felt like doing, and I just said, why not? I can put them all, in a way I want to, with colors and all that, and what I remember of them, what can I use as a symbol, etc. When I started it, I had no intention of thinking that people would be interested in buying them, in putting them, on their walls. In a way, it's kind of strange to feel that, okay, my family are in the walls of other people's houses and all that, but why not?
One of the first things that struck me was this lack of color in the country, and how you saw these incredibly solid and unforgiving chadors, and they had become the norm. Whereas in Esfahan, where I grew up, my grandmother and my aunt only wore the black chador on very special occasions, for mourning periods or for very formal occasions at the mosque. The rest of the time they would have light flowery chadors that they wore. So I wanted to deconstruct the black and show you, in a sense, how incredibly colorful Iranian women are, because Iranian women are like peacocks. I mean, if you go to Iran, they are incredibly well groomed. They are very beautiful. and incredibly sexy.
For most Americans, those images from the days of the revolution and the hostage crisis, anything that was on television was the first impression. I come from a very proud family, a family that's very proud of our culture, but I felt sort of cheated. I felt like the version of Persian culture that I was forced to inherit was this cartoon that you see on the news of angry, humorless, menacing. And this is an image that's reinforced, it's been reinforced for 30 years. While I felt fearless in the studio in making images and wouldn't censor myself, I would censor myself afterwards. So even though this painting was in the Bronx, I was told them you can't photograph it, you can't use any photographs of this painting, I wouldn't put it on my website. I was afraid of putting it in a blatantly Iranian context. I was afraid to put it in that context because I was afraid of that people who would end up seeing the show could be people from the government.
Really interesting.
I always feel like when I'm making my films, I'm trying to re-enter into a dialogue about those tumultuous events with these artists and kind of communicate with them not to recreate those high stakes, but to actually enter into a dialogue. I'm not going to use a lot of narration, but I can use my own understanding, my own empathy to connect with them and capture that on film, and then use the artwork, which is truly their way of communicating, it's their language, to illustrate a lot of that. So I kind of feel like there's a whole lot of drama that can be manifest in that, first off, in the discussion, in the going through of memories and reliving things. And then sometimes it's just even more heightened with a video piece or a photograph or a painting or some other visual aspect.
So you seem to be sort of gravitating toward these events that are completely devastating, disrupting, it completely shatters every infrastructure of their lives, and then to see them rebuild themselves or come to terms with their changed situation. You've talked to people after Katrina and you've seen their art.
Probably more than the other three, I had just a bit of awe. And I started the first interviews 5 years after Katrina, and I just felt like, what's the word? Like if I was going back into a wound that, everyone in America saw Hurricane Katrina played out on TV over and over. And in a lot of ways, it was used by certain factions to attack the right and say things about the Bush administration. And yes, all of those things were there were definite tragic mistakes, but I didn't want to do a Katrina film that blamed one side or the other. I kind of saw it as a biblical kind of mythic situation. There were individuals who lived through it and used their work. I mean, Jennifer Shaw comes to mind, where she's like, I don't know how some people who didn't have a creative outlet made sense of it.
I think having my art as a creative outlet saved me, and I don't know how people who didn't have some form of creative expression were able to get through the aftermath, because it was really, very intense and trying for a long, long time.
In the 18th and 19th century, it was common practice to take hair from the deceased and fashion it into all different kinds of jewelry and objects of sentiment as a way to hold on to your loved one. After the storm, I had friends here that were trying to fix up their houses or that were living under, whatever conditions within their houses. And I would come down and visit with them and drive around. And at the time I started photographing, I really didn't have a project in mind. They were snapshots. I really was just trying, like everybody else, to drive around and understand the extent of the damage. And it wasn't until I found the hair that I kind of put the two together and started realizing that these photographs were really, that could be source imagery. I was driving along St. Claude Avenue, saw the St. Claude Beauty Supply. It's still a bright pink building, the sign is still there, and they just had a mound of trash outside of it. And I hopped out at some point to take a picture of it and then realized that it was hair, that it was a giant pile of, that this is a beauty store, it's a hair store. All of the wigs and hair extensions and stuff that had been sitting in boxes on the floor and had flooded, I don't know exactly how many feet. Of course, this material had been in the water for at least 2 weeks and it was molded and it was not a pretty sight, but my friend that I was with happened to have a big roll of garbage bags in his van, and we immediately found a box of rubber gloves and an industrial bottle of shampoo. And I filled some of the bags with hair that I could find and brought it back to the studio and spent some time, washing it and conditioning it and combing it. There are a lot of contemporary artists that I like very much that work with hair, but what I immediately thought of was some beautiful samples of Victorian hair work. The intricacy of them and that connection to loss sort of came together at that moment. To me, it was sort of that they became a sort of a surrogate to those folks that weren't going to be able to come back and rejoin their neighborhoods and their communities. So I guess my houses became sort of a stand-in for them, sort of a portrait or a reminder that that there had been a community here, or there had been a neighborhood here that was lost. That's what you saw. Everywhere you looked was an empty house.
That was intensely moving, this intense urge to sort of reclaim the place and to memorialize the past that they remembered. You've talked to Chinese artists after the death of Mao Zedong, as well as the new wave feminists. What's the kind of research that you put into a film like The F Word, for instance, which is your latest film?
I will read and know as much as I can when it comes to the F word about past generations of feminists and performance, because so many of the artists mentioned Carolee Schneemann and Hannah Wilke, that I definitely had to know a whole lot about them. I wanted to know about them in the editing process. Kathy, of course, Dr. Kathy Batista had spoken about them in her initial interview. So a lot of times I'll do the interviews with the experts that are featured in the film early on. Before I even do that, I read as much about these artists that I've chosen, read all their past interviews, read their artist statements, see what critics have said about their work. And in that way, I learned that actually with the Chinese film, when I spoke through, I don't speak a word of Mandarin, but to speak through a translator, they could see that I wasn't using notes, that I knew the names of works that they had done, and I got a sense immediately when they saw that I wasn't using notes, but speaking to somebody who then translated and back, that I had done the preparation. And they were very respectful of what I had done in thinking about their work, that they opened up even more to, other sorts of questions. But I have to do that because I don't have a huge budget, but I'm thinking of the F word. You know, a lot of these women do what a lot of people would deem very provocative, obviously very personal work. And I am a double outsider in a lot of ways, being a man. There was some question, but actually pretty much not every artist, but I gave copies of Pearls on the Ocean Floor to them and said, like, this is kind of my second feminist film because I did this other one. And when they saw Pearls on the Ocean Floor and they saw that I had interviewed Shirin Ashad and some other great Iranian female artists, they said, yeah, a lot of the artists have spoken about the lack of opportunity for female artists to get recognized. There's a whole section in the film where Dr. Kathy Batista speaks about how there are a lot of 26-year-old painters that are selling paintings for $1 million, but none of them are women. And in her book about feminist art, she looked at feminist performance in London in the late 60s and early 70s and found that those women who were marginalized, in many ways, female performers, again, are marginalized and on the outside. And even though they're starting to be brought into the museum and into the institutions, women, you know, they just opened the Broad Museum in Los Angeles, a huge collection. Eli Broad is one of the largest collectors of contemporary and modern, definitely in Los Angeles. And yet only 17% of the artwork in that great museum is the product of female hands. And it's 2015, so I can understand why some women of this younger generation have decided to once again, like, reinvestigate what it is to be a woman, to use their body, to use it as they see fit and where they're taking control of it.
When you stop being the subject and you start being the actor or the actress in your own life as an artist, I think that's very important. You know, you have to take hold of the subject. And I feel that a lot of the younger artists are doing that. You know, they're putting themselves into their work. They're dealing with their subjectivity, their sexual nature. Sometimes it may go too far for my taste. It can be hard to take. It can be hard to look at. And not all of this work is fun.
Now, the scary thing is, I see a lot of younger women saying that feminism isn't important. It's happened, it's done. We are paid equally. Well, yes, on paper, by law, we have to be paid equally. But if you look at any economic research, it's not true. It's not true in the art world and it's not true in the world. If you look at a timeline of artists and the market, and you look at the prices that male artists hit, these artists, Barbara Kruger, Cindy Sherman, Laurie Simmons, they're still a fraction of the money that people pay for male artists. Even 26-year-old male artists, you get people spending $1 million on, you know, a 26-year-old painter. It rarely happens for a female painter. When you think of the hype around certain young male artists, I would put in there Oscar Murillo, Jacob Kasich, Lucian Smith, Parker Ito. It's interesting that you don't get young women with that kind of hype. And so I believe that there's this subconscious inherent distrust of young women artists. So there's a lot of talk about the boom of the art market, but the radical end of that, the practice of people young and willing to put themselves on the line, still in a way is marginalized.
I've been really influenced by a lot of work by women who are no longer alive, but I don't know so much what their real experience was being an artist in the art world. My intention for my project is that it be alive in many different arenas, and so although I am in the art world, I also work in a lot of different worlds. I really am so interested in being as broad and impactful as possible with my project, and for it to be out in the world where people can experience it And I just feel that the art world, with the offerings of a show every couple of years in a small gallery where only a handful of people might see it, is just so unsatisfying to me. As an art sister, I enjoy portraying many different characters, often within the space of one short performance. With Red Riding Hood, I could play all the characters. Red Riding Hood, in the traditional reading, impresses upon young girls to stay on the path, quote unquote. And if one deviates from the path, one is finding themselves in danger. But in the end, she has to return on the path back to her mother, back to what her mother represents, traditional ideas around womanhood, domesticity. And I thought, well, would it be more radical if the story takes a different turn? There's so many possibilities for deeper readings and for liberation. You know, we have the overly protective mother who wants us to stay on a straight line, stay on the path and not deviate, who's afraid of that, afraid of what will happen to us. You know, we have this vicious wolf inside of us who wants to dominate and who wants to consume, and we have this hunter who, oppressed by his own position in society, this brand of maleness and this need to use weapons to kill. And so again, we can look at what each of these characters says about us, and there's an opportunity for self-reflection there.
If you took suffragettes as first wave, and then you took second wave being from the 1970s, the women that when you have a museum show about feminism, you usually understand.
You have Gloria Steinem, you have consciousness-raising groups, you have Now, you have Angela Davis.
Then there's the third wave, which is, I would say, the kind of Barbara Kruger, Cindy Sherman, where feminism becomes more resolved visually.
Third was really a reaction to the second, in the sense that it was really only dealing with middle and upper middle class white women's issues. So they also call it third world feminism as well, and we get a lot of intersectional perspectives, women of color, queer women, Bell Hooks, and Audre Lorde. I think a lot of people think for third wave, they think Riot Girl, even though that was a music movement, sort of the zine culture, and Kathleen Hanna writing Slut on her stomach and sort of saying girls can be in a band, they don't have to, you know, just be the girlfriend of the guy in the band. We get to the fourth wave, and that's still, as of yet, undefined. Whereas in years past, there was a lot of discussion about what women shouldn't do with their bodies in order to respect themselves. It's the same thing, but it's sort of twisted on its head, that women should do these things with their bodies because they respect themselves. You know, you can have as many partners, whatever types of people, and do whatever you like with your body and be a feminist.
The celebration or public presentation of sexuality is still looked down upon for a woman. And I hope that with these ideas of fourth wave feminism and other developments that will start to change how we feel towards it.
We are a queer, transnational feminist collective. Our main tenet is embodied feminism. We're really actively embodying female power and accessing the archetypal realm of the goddess. In many ways, it is a reaction to second and first wave feminism, in the sense of this reaction to a sort of quagmire of theory and the sloganeering that was using language in a way that was divisive, and sort of just a jumping off point to incorporate other ways of experiencing female power.
Fascinating.
In fact, I want to do something else, maybe looking at global feminism.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you for watching Indie Film Forum. I'm Kalpana Biswas. For more information about Robert Adanto and Indie Film Forum, please visit our websites.